mental health and wondered about, written about forever. Where we're talking about, unfortunately, suicides, people going off the job for mental health, but same thing with the fire service, but it's been around forever.
Right. Yeah. It just hasn't been something that we've talked about a lot, right? In the fire service, it hasn't been one of those things that has been a topic of popular conversation.
Overtly, right. We've had those, just like substance use, we've had those back corner closet conversations, but not at roll calls, trainings, recruitment, retirement. It's most people will say, for example, like, hey, how'd you sleep? He goes, I'll sleep when I'm dead. Well, guess what? Most of those guys that said that are dead.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, that exposure leads to cancer. Protect yourself with MagnaGrip. To learn more, visit magnagrip.com. Welcome to Mental Health Monthly with Dan DeGryse and Chris Muscle.
Well, welcome everybody, wherever you are, whatever time it is, work, home, play, whatever you're doing, car, looking at us on Facebook, or just listening through your phone. My name's Dan DeGryse. My co-host is Chris Muscle, and this is Mental Health Monthly, offered to you by Fire Engineering. I think we got a pretty cool show today, even though we don't have a guest. It's going to be us two, so get ready for it. We're going to try to keep it to an hour, so you know how much time you got with us. But welcome, and Chris, how are you doing?
Good. It's down here in Texas, it's hot right now.
Tell me what hot is. Tell me what hot is.
I think today's in the 90s, so it's cooler for us.
All right, I don't have the humidity. What's the humidity right now?
Oh, I'd have to look.
Because that's what makes it hotter, right?
Yeah, for sure. What's your humidity?
59%.
59. I don't even know.
That's kind of like what my memory is right now. About 59%.
66.
Oh, 66. So it's not that. Come on, it's not that hot. Stop. So, well, for those of you that have joined us, like I said, most of the time, Chris and I have a guest, but we want to talk about something that affects me a little bit, a lot of my friends a lot, and I don't think it affects McKinney, Texas right now, or other certain departments, but 30,000 departments across the country, it does. So, ironically enough, even before this, I decided to do a little research. And again, I'm not a Google doc, but you look up Google just to see what is out there. And so think in your head, and this may not be across the country, but it's something that I've talked to people that are working or retired. It's like, what are the 5? So I searched, what are the biggest challenges facing the fire service right now? And one thing came up, the 5 biggest issues, and then another one came up to 10 challenges facing the American fire service. Before I read it, and it's not a test, Chris, but tell me what you think the top 1 or 2 or 3 challenges are.
I would say the top 3: recruitment, burnout. I think those are probably the top 2 big ones that just, without even thinking hard, pop right into my head. Like recruitment and burnout, which is crazy because
I like that. What do you think the 3rd or 4th one is?
I would say retention.
I don't want your I don't want your
Retention.
hair to catch on fire. Oh, it is on fire. Okay.
Retention.
So number one in both are recruitment and retention. So very good, which ironically is going to be part of our conversation today. Give me two others.
So recruitment, retention.
You said burnout, which I'll equate to mental health.
Yeah, burnout. And then longevity. This kind of goes with burnout, I guess. But I feel like you see maybe more and more guys doing 20 and out or versus the 30.
Yeah, that's retention again. I think that all are pieces to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
One that it's a recurrent one is really funding. So it has to do with money, both from a organizational standpoint, something that we're not necessarily going to talk about, but it falls into recruitment because now when I came on, it was just get on the job, right? Competing against, and again, big cities, small town, volunteer department, whatever it may be. I competed. Well, we all competed universally in '85 with 45,000 other people to get on a job, but we hire probably from that list about 2,500. I don't know, do the math on a percentage, but there are some departments used to get 350 for one or two positions. But ironically, some will say like the number one issue is mental health. But here's what I want to say about that is that it's really then there's been a focus and a spotlight on mental health, kind of like funding, but it's been around forever.
Right.
I mean, mental health, everybody's been dealing with it.
Everyone's dealt with it, right? No. From the early days.
Yeah. Right.
Everyone's dealt with it honest. From the early days.
You came from the military, right? Mental health has been discussed and researched and wondered about, written about forever. Well, we're talking about, unfortunately, suicides, people going off the job for mental health, but same thing with the fire service, but it's been around forever.
Right. Yeah. It just hasn't been something that we've talked about a lot, right? In the fire service, it hasn't been one of those things that has been a topic of popular conversation.
Overtly, right. We've had those, just like substance use, we've had those back corner closet conversations, but not at roll calls, trainings, recruitment, retirement. It's most people will say, for example, like, hey, how'd you sleep? He goes, I'll sleep when I'm dead. Well, guess what? Most of those guys that said that are dead because bad sleep, poor sleep, lack of sleep is associated with heart disease.
Yeah. And I think that we've talked about it before. There's a dual responsibility in it, right? From an organizational standpoint and from our own standpoint to make it a priority.
So tell me a little bit more about that. Yeah. Dual responsibility.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll start with the individual, our own responsibility first, right? Like you talk about roll call, or we always talk about the kitchen table, right? That's the sacred place in the firehouse where all the world's problems are solved. There's bankers, there's counselors, there's plumbers, there's roofers, there's doctors, right? And we sit there and talk about something cool like putting a new roof on or building a whatever, or even on the job stuff, technical rescue, and everybody's all bought in, right? And then somebody's like, hey, let's talk about mental health for a minute. You're like, wait, what? The table just disperses. Oh, I got to go do this. I got to go do that. Oh, I got to go downtown, whatever. Right. So we have to, I don't know what the right word is, normalize it, make it. But then from a departmental standpoint, there's departments that are doing it really well. There's departments that are figuring it out. And there's departments that aren't there yet. I think they would want to be. But for example, maybe your department, you look at the training calendar for the year, right? And there's training every month on fire stuff. There's training every month on EMS stuff. But is there any mental health training on there? Right? There might be for the peer support team, if you have one. There might be for the leadership, but is there department-wide mental health training? And it doesn't even have to be, training's a big word, right? But is there anything mental health? Like, hey, this next month,
Well, I can tell you for me,
throwing the ladders or stretching. Yeah.
I could tell you for me, I know there's a little lag here. I don't know why. Maybe it's the heat, but in my 30 years, in the first 15, I wasn't an EMT, so I didn't have to go to continuing education classes. But if I wanted to pay and then I wanted a retirement, I had to go to those classes. So I did. The last 15 years of my career, there were 2 behavioral health classes, not for the general, dealing with the general population. It was for us. I'm like, oh, okay. But 2 out of how many thousands of hours of training that I had, that's unfortunate. And it has to be the fabric of the fire department. But that's what's cool about this is that when Chief Rhodes called me up and said, and you know this conversation is that he's like, hey, I'm doing this new platform and I want a discussion on mental health, mental wellness, and that's why we call it Mental Health Monthly. We're not calling it mental illness. We're not calling it substance use. We're not calling it a disorder. This is really mental health. And like you said, when I asked you about challenges in the fire service, burnout. And you mentioned something as, all the men and women that I came on with, we weren't working until we died. Most of a good about 1,500 over the last 5 years decided to retire at 55 with most of our faculties, mine minus a couple. This is where you insert the joke.
Yeah. Thought about it.
But I think that is one of the challenges now that it's facing the recruitment aspect is that there's been so much conversation about PTSD, depression, suicide, that the generation X, Z, whatever we're at now with this next generation is that, I don't want to go there and catch Ebola. I'm using that as a term other than like PTSD or suicidality. But it's going to be important to the organizations and leaders. And when I think of leaders, again, I think of Bobby Halton and I think of Chief Rhodes with fire engineering, a huge platform to have a discussion to say, there's these things that will potentially happen, we're exposed to, but we could come out the other end as good, if not better, if we have training and education. And I think that's partly why we're here.
Yeah, without a doubt. And mental health, right, is affected every day on the job, right? It's something that we live day in and day out. It doesn't, it's not like mental health says, well, you have to go on this bad run or that bad run for you to be affected. And the thing about it is the way people are affected, it's different for everybody, right? Like maybe this run didn't bother you, but it bothered me, which complicates it. It's not like this crew at this station, they're only affected by this magnitude of runs, right? You could have 5 guys on a run and 3 of them might be affected by it, 2 of them might not, right? And so, but the big thing is day in and day out, we're affected mentally. And I shouldn't use the word affected. Maybe that's not the right word, but we have a response.
No, I think that's. I think that's the right word. You didn't say negatively. You just said affected.
Right.
When you go outside,
and again,
the temperature is going to affect you.
Right. And I think that sometimes in the world of mental health, we think of it and we create this, I don't know, this perception that it's the bad call. What is the bad call? Oh, somebody got pulled out of a house fire. Oh, you saw a really bad accident where somebody didn't make it, right? You could go on a call that is it could be a child living in poor conditions that could affect you. Maybe you had something from your childhood that triggered something, right? And so that's the point that I'm trying to use, is that it's not these world stage calls that make the world news that only bother you. There are things that happen
right
day in and day out. But then, like you said, it goes back to it. Well, we got one mental health training class on the calendar in 12 months. Was that enough?
Well, I've learned throughout my career
That's the $1 million
that
question, right?
it is the cumulative effect. Very seldom is it a single incident. Single incidents could be traumatic, but we are very resilient and able to digest that physically, mentally, and emotionally. The question is when people close to us pass away, whether it be heart attack, cancer, suicide, line of duty death, and personal people we lose, and then the years of exposure on the job, 15 to 40 years, usually what will happen when I end up getting involved with somebody where somebody will call me or somebody will call me about somebody and I have a conversation with somebody, I'm like, don't tell me just about the last incident. Tell me more about your history. Tell me from the time you came on the job, and usually it's been 10 to 20 years. That's usually the mark that I see. Some people get promoted and some have multiple promotions, added stress and responsibility. People take that home in decision making. Then you got organizational stress. Usually then the things that pull at people are the losses of their loved ones, whether it be parents, sister, or spouses, and then the losses that they see on the job that relate to personal things in their life and or double losses on the job and at home. That usually in a conversation of about an hour comes out, and it's like the straw that broke the camel's back. Hey, I'm different. One thing I want to say too is, and I've even had this said to me by people close to me, is, well, why can't I get the old Dan back? Why can't I get the old Mike back? Why can't I get the old Chris back? Well, good luck with that, because that's not going to happen, because we grow, we change, we morph by the exposures that we have. Maybe call it callous, maybe call it wisdom, or somewhere in between. And what we have to have, and again, going back to fire engineering, Bobby Halton, Chief Rhodes, and there's others too, but this is the platform we're on, is the ability to have this conversation like me and you have had many times.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, that exposure leads to cancer. Protect yourself with MagnaGrip. To learn more, visit magnagrip.com.
Yeah, I think along with all that, something else that we have to, it really needs to be at the forefront of our minds as we're going through that career, right? We've talked about this before, right? Like, how you doing? I'm good. Right? And there's been times where you're like, no, for real, how you doing? Right? We don't see it because it's just like, it goes back to being compounded, right? Well, taking the next run. And so it just gets stored away. So going through that 10, 15, 20-year career, you think you're good, and we don't do anything throughout our career to work on it. And then you walk away from it, and what happens? And I'm still on the job, obviously. But I, as you know, took an assignment in our headquarters division. So I don't go on runs on a shift basis like I used to, very few and far between right now. And even still being on the job and being in this profession and dealing with peer support, there was a short time period there when I made that transition that there were some things I had to work through. Right. And why is that? It's because that whole space opened up and it wasn't compounded by the next run or the next run or the next run or the next run. Right. And so all that stuff, as you change, you have to be forward thinking. And I'm good now, but what does 5 years look like, 2 years look like, 10 years look like, right? Because eventually it's gonna hit you. You might be the 1%er where it doesn't, or the 5%. I don't know what the statistics are, but majority of the people, right? You see it all the time,
are going to be affected. So again, going back to the original comment in regards to me Googling the challenges in the fire service, right? Mental health was number 1 on one, number 6 on another. And while that's going to be in a part of the conversation, the other one that's number 1 and 2 is recruitment and retention. So I'm retired 4.5 years. Every single person I talk to, every single fire chief, every single training officer, every single person that works for a department, I ask them the same thing. And while there's still the organizational stress and all the other things, we could list, 10, they say that currently their biggest struggle is recruitment and retention. And then what I'm thinking of, unless something changes like really fast, what is it going to look like in 5 years? I've talked to fire chiefs who have had from combination departments. Guys from the Midwest can't talk that fast, and I get all jumbled. I try to do that, and my buddies from the East Coast are like, "Good job, Dan." You
say it real fast 3 times, right?
And so they've had to have 3 lists in 1 year. We have another combination. There I go again. Combination department that went through 23 people. Now all 23 didn't join their department, but with lateral transfers, competition, not passing a background check or whatever it is, they had to have another list within 6 months. That's got to be exhausting right now, and fearful in the next couple years. Like, if it's this bad now, how do we stop the bleeding? The good thing is guys like you, right, that work for great departments, McKinney, Texas, you guys are solid, right? Even though you're growing and you're expanding, you probably have the leadership that people are like, hey, I want to work for McKinney, kind of like you did when you moved departments.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Leadership is key, but it wasn't always that way, but it's things like leadership because,
well, it was with McKinney. It just wasn't with the other department you were with, I'm assuming, right? Based on what you just said.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. But it is key. Retention is difficult. And like you said, is it going to get worse? You look at departments like the bigger departments where you don't have to be certified. You just come test, we'll put you through school. And to see those departments that still have, like you said, a fraction testing today compared to maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago, that's concerning. Especially when you look at the benefits and the pay. And that's not why we all do it, but it's important. You got to be able to feed your family and take care of them and such. But there are things, leadership, focus on mental health, focusing on the organization, but also the individual, right? Making it a place where they want to come to work. And I think that term, do a job you love, you'll never work a day in your life. I think that gets thrown around a lot, right? Is that really true? Depend on the department you work for. And that's where, something that makes retention challenging, and to me, just makes you scratch your head as you see, my situation was a little different.
As I scratch my head, right?
Yeah, my situation was a little different, but I did it. But you see guys leaving one department for another department, right?
Yeah,
I haven't been doing this
lateral transfer.
right. I haven't been doing this near as long as you. Say that very nicely. But you look at history of the fire service, that wasn't a thing back in the day, right? Like you didn't see guys.
It wasn't, which
like
is
you are today.
creating another thing, a gap between the
Right.
2, 3, 4-year member, the 18-year member, and then the friggin' fire chief and the assistant chief.
Right. Yeah. So those are all challenges. But once again, that can create a mental challenge for anybody. Right? It's the added stresses, it's the added daily, you feel like your head's gonna sometimes. Right? And guess what? It wasn't because you were taking in a bad run. Like it's the everyday stuff that we deal with that we're talking about.
Right. So if you were the fire chief of X department that had a issue with recruitment and retention, and I know that you're working in the academy, so you're dealing with some of the new fresh meat personnel out there, what would be advice you would offer based on what you've gleaned in the last year?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, but it's a tall question. The first thing it's the obvious. You got to look at, competitive market, right? Like your salaries and area and benefits and that those kind of things. But then you got to look internally. What is our culture and what is our, right? Culture is probably the best way to sum it up. It's culture, right? It's not standards. Standards have been set long before, whether it's Department X, Department Y, Department Z. Standards have been set long before, from the horse and, buggy days, right? It's what is the culture? Because, the firefighter network is strong. And you talk to, oh man, you don't want to come here. It's miserable, right? We could pay the best in the area. People aren't going to go work there. Not in today's world. Maybe back in the day, guys were like, oh, I can put up with it. That's a pretty good paycheck. Right. But everybody, for the most part, depending on the area that Department X is in, departments around there are probably paying pretty comparative. Right? You have to be competitive. It's culture. That is what I would go back and look at. 100%.
So I kind of like it. I don't love it not because of the idea behind it, but because of the word you use, culture.
Okay.
And that's because I got my butt chewed out by Bobby Halton when I mentioned culture years ago on a podcast. Oh yeah. So I get to do the same thing and chew a little bit off your rear, in a sense that culture is kind of thoughts and beliefs of a group, right? But it doesn't come out of thin air. It comes from something, comes from people, right? So culture is a byproduct or a product of the people within that organization as well as outside the organization and what we do with it. And that, I'm going to use the word leadership, regardless of rank. And then how we promote that both on shift and off shift. And one of the greatest lessons that I've ever learned is that, luckily, because of being in the behavioral health world and looking out for other people, even though sometimes it hurt me because I pulled away from my own family, the greatest lesson I learned is the ability, kind of like in recovery, right? The AA and NA program is to give the gift that was freely given to you in my opinion, which is mentorship. When I look back at my career, when I had other people, even though we mentored a little bit different back in the 80s and 90s, when they were trying to get a certain character out of me, when I offered that to rank and file as I moved up, not only did I become a buffer between some of the chaos above, but I created a connection with the membership. And what I'm going to say is, the one thing that I would offer anybody out there that's trying to create recruitment and retention, number one is leadership, because people don't leave departments, they leave leadership or bad bosses. And two, you got to create a connection and evaluation, good and bad. Like, we've had many conversations over the years. You probably haven't liked all the things that I've said to you, but very seldom will I keep the truth from you, in my opinion, and let you do with it what you want. That's what I've offered other people in my relationship with them. They'll know I'll try to be as honest as I possibly can. And what we don't do for most departments is do annual evaluations. We used to do that 35 years ago in my department. You got an opportunity to sit down with the officer, and not after a run, but sit down and connect with that person, even though you were scared to death, much like I did as an athlete and in school. Most of the time in school, when I was doing poorly, and then you got to sit down with your counselor or your professor, it was never like, "Hey, Dan, you are killing it." You, on the other hand, I know, I know you got a couple of master's degrees, so you obviously did pretty good in school. Me, on the other hand, I got a kick in my butt from my counselor and a couple of my teachers. And then I'm like, oh, they're not just going to give this to me. I got to work for it. So a little bit of tough love. My point is, if you're following me, is that we may not always like what we hear, but if we get the opportunity to develop a relationship, not just a hierarchy with the people within our department, that creates a bond, a tribe, a relationship. And then it's like being woven together. That's what I think for retention.
Yeah. And I, what you said about culture and leadership, I like that, because when you asked me that, I thought culture and leadership, and I think I was just using the word in the wrong context. I think adding to that real quick is, oftentimes we think as leadership, like you said, the chief or the assistant chief or the company officer, when we all know leadership happens at every level. So maybe that's the focus, right? And for example, obviously, I was in the Marine Corps. If you look at the Marine Corps, the Marine Corps is led by small unit leadership, right? It's not the guy with 3 stars on the collar and the captain bars. It's the small unit leadership. It's the senior guys in the firehouse that are just the firefighter. It's the drivers. It's the, so yeah, I like that.
And now that you said that, which I totally hear you and agree, is that leader that used to be there for 7, 10, 12, 15 years, or maybe even longer, now is being pulled up the ranks. I met a guy the other day that 44 years old, that's the fire chief. Not to say that he doesn't deserve it, but man, there's so much to be learned throughout that process, not only individually to get to that point, but then to offer back to the people that are going to follow you there. So now that gap, right, that all plays a part in that recruitment and retention and that bond. Because I'm sure that 44-year-old fire chief is like, man, boy, would I like to be on that back step with those guys, but there's nobody else. Hopefully he was the best candidate, but not to say there's nobody else, but at that particular level, because of lateral transfers, death, retirement, and whatever else happened.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, so recruitment and retention, right? So we just suggested have those small groups, identify leadership. It goes both ways, and continue that conversation and evaluation on a continual basis, not just when crap goes south. How about, I know it's going to be a little bit for you, especially because you got 3 kids, retirement. Retirement should be a positive thing, but a lot of times what I hear with retirement is, oh, that person went off the deep end, or oh, that retiree died by suicide, or oh, he or she drank himself to death. We hear all the bad news, kind of like which is similar with OSHA and NFPA and NIOSH. We keep all the deaths and line of duty deaths and injuries, but we never talk about all the successes.
Right.
Which I'm gonna bring in one of the mental health challenges, which we'll talk about in a minute, that I have seen with individuals that struggle is negative thinking. So negative self-talk, right? But before we get there, from retirement, what's the consensus in McKinney and around by you when somebody brings up the word retirement?
That's a big question.
I don't ask small questions, man. You gotta knock this out of the park. I'm trying to throw you softballs, and come on, you don't bunt in softball. Do you know how to play softball?
It's not. Yeah. I totally could play softball.
Not 12-inch, but 16 clincher.
Take it easy. I don't think so. Retirement, and it's not one of those things that's widely talked about. It's not. I can. So one, it's not, people don't just openly, widely talk about it, which I don't really understand. The other thing, I think the bigger thing, and I've, you mentioned working in the academy and stuff the last year. I think something that's even bigger is, what about those retirees when they leave? I think that's a big part of it. Right? If a retiree walks into your firehouse, is the young kid going to know who that is? Right. And so
not after 3 or 4 years.
Right. And so, it's a 2-part challenge, I think. You don't hear the guys. I feel like more guys than not don't look forward to retirement. I don't know. I could be missing that. I'm clearly not in that.
So are you saying a generalization, or are you saying a McKinney?
I'm saying a generalization. Right.
Okay, because I'll tell you, the greater majority of the people I know from my department, not to say because during July 4th weekend we had 150 shootings, we look forward to retirement. Most of the guys, I play golf with 140 other individuals in a 2-man scramble. Not all of them, but in tournaments. And most of them are retired. Every time I meet another one, they're like, oh yeah, I'm getting a place in Alabama, Texas, Tennessee, Florida, building a home, going to my all enjoying.
So maybe it is down in this area. I just don't hear a lot of, I don't know. It's, but I guess it makes you, I don't know. It's just not talked about widely. Like, you hear guys say, oh yeah, the next couple of years I'm going to retire. Or, you hear the guy say, I can go any day. I've got enough years on. But it makes you wonder, is it because they love the job that much they don't want to hang it up? Or Is it because there's a little bit of fear of that's all you've known? And this isn't a bad thing for the last 20, 25, 30, 35 years, right? Is there a little bit of fear of what's that? And I'm sure you can talk to that, right? I mean, 30
yeah,
plus years on the job.
Well, I can. I was looking forward to it, but I didn't know what it was going to be like until, people were asking me, well, what do you think? And I go, I don't know. I'm not there yet, but I'm looking forward to it. And you haven't heard me say a bad thing about retirement because I'm not retired per se. I've always had something else. Most of the guys, when I came on the job, they only lasted 4 to 7 years, and that wasn't in good health. Now we're living longer, but I'm just going to pose this to you is nowadays academies are 6 months typically. Some are 3 months, but ours in Chicago is 6 months. We have a 4-hour seminar for retirement.
Yeah.
I mean, what the hell?
Yeah, 4 hours.
Yeah.
Right, like 30 years and then 4 hours.
Yeah. So
right?
Why isn't, if fire departments, fire chiefs, and all those people don't want people to go off the deep end, why aren't we having a phase out?
Right.
2 to 5
and
years, something.
Right. And not just a phase out, but I like the word low hanging fruit, right? Because there's a lot of things we can do that are quote unquote low hanging fruit. And I mean, I wasn't there, but obviously they did it well for you. But it's the little things, like a guy retires 30 years on the job and it's his final day. And you're like, all right, see you, bud. Like ceremonies, like send offs, like there's another department in my area that does a monthly retiree luncheon. It's little things like that. And you have a guy that went 30 years on the job, and every third day he woke up and went to that firehouse. Christmas, birthdays, regular days, bad weather days, whatever. And then he puts in his paper and he retires on a Monday morning at 7 a.m. That's his final ride. 6:30 in the morning, whatever. And then nothing. Do we still have an obligation to an extent to take care of him? Right? The job's taking care of him. He's taking care of the job for...
I would say absolutely not. No responsibility to take care of him, but to prepare him.
Okay.
And if you don't prepare yourself, kind of like that thing that you said from the department and the individual, it's as important for the individual to prepare yourself for that retirement as the organization to offer you a little bit of transition understanding.
I like it. That's why we have these conversations, right?
And so that also tied to the mental health aspect of it, because like you said, 30 years of the same routine, now stop it.
Not easy. Right?
Not normal.
Not normal. I mean, how long did it take you, small example, to get into a normal sleep routine?
2.5 years.
Or 2.5 years.
Well,
right?
I take that back. So it took me, so when I became a battalion chief, it got off the job. I got in a normal, well, not normal. I mean, I went to bed at 8:30 and got up at 3:30, but I had to focus on that. So I made that a priority, because going to bed at midnight and then waking up at 3:30 and trying to do anything is not normal. So I had a routine. When I retired, it took me a couple of weeks to start to be able to sleep stay in bed till 6. Staying in bed till 7, 8 was not even a thought. Couldn't do it. Not capable. Took me 2.5 years to sleep through a night once because of learned response. And we all know how our sleep is screwed up.
Yeah.
But there's a thing called sleep hygiene. There's a thing called hygiene, and we're learning this. You talk to Dr. Sarah Jenke or anybody that does research in regards to sleep. Ours is screwed up. We could get into the shifts what's the best shift. But as soon as you start to have too many runs, more than 2 or 3 runs in a given night, that throws off your sleep. So, but my point to your question, my answer is that you have to be intentional and you have to have some sort of plan based on the variables in your life.
Yeah. And I think super important. I think going back on the comment about the department's responsibility, maybe the department doesn't have responsibility. I agree with what you're saying, but maybe going back to the mental health, there's things that, whether it's the department, it's the union, it's just a group of other retired guys. Like maybe there's things that can happen in that retirement. And that little thing, like a monthly breakfast, maybe a monthly golf outing. Maybe that's something that's enough to keep them to feel like they're still connected to the job or the people that they've spent a third of their life with the past.
Yeah, like I said, number one is when I came on the job, all we did is we saw the ticker come across and say, unfortunately, Dan DeGryse died, blah, blah, blah. Jimmy Burns, Joe Sheridan died. We saw that. We never saw, hey, they had their, 63rd birthday, or we had a retiree luncheon. Like I said, we have 160 golfers in this thing when we started with 16 7 years ago, and the greater majority are retired. That's not from the department. That's from a buddy of mine, Rich Pinsky, that started to Ignite the Spirit, a benevolent fund. Anyhow, so I know we don't have much more time left, but what I want to do then is talk about. So thanks for that conversation, and I'm happy to talk about it. Anybody knows how to get a hold of me or look me up on Facebook, I'm happy to talk about retirement. But how about
I'll call you someday.
So we talked about in about 40 years. Recruitment. We talked about recruitment, retention, retirement. And the last R that I have is recovery. Kind of on the same lines of mental health, but from a daily basis, how do we recover from the shift, from our exposure, both physically, mentally, emotionally? How can we recover? And then for those that develop a mental health condition or substance use, recovery.
Yeah. You got to have a framework first. You got to know what that looks like for you. Again, that's the cool thing and the challenging thing about mental health is there's not a one answer fits all. Everybody's different, right? So you have to know what your framework looks like for you. Recovery on the job. Maybe it's you get off and you like to go for a walk. Maybe gym, play basketball. Maybe whatever it is. And there's got to be small. There has to be achievable things that you can do, right? Me saying, well, for recovery, for me, I like to go to the Rangers game. Well, for one, that's not a year-round thing, or maybe there's not tickets, maybe I can't afford it. So, right, you have to have little things like, I'm gonna go for a run. So you got to have your framework, and there can be multiple things within that framework, and there can be things that you can do in the moment. There can be things that you can plan, right? So I think framework, which we can talk about, what's your function look like, and then what are the steps to get there? But it has to be a priority in your day, in your week, in your month, in your year. It has to be a priority. I can't say other people, but for me, I don't get the luxury of saying, I'll focus on my recovery next week. Pretty busy. Yeah, let me put on my calendar for next month on the first Monday of the month. Doesn't work like that. I'll give you a prime example. For me, I go to counseling. You know that every week. Every week at 4:00, I go to counseling. I don't build counseling around my schedule. I build my schedule around counseling. I can tell you, for me, if I miss a week, I miss an appointment, I cancel or don't go, I could be having the best week in the world. And I'm telling you, when I miss, my week feels off for the following week until I get back in my counseling session. That's part of my framework. And I know that. And there's times that it's very rare, but there are times I have to cancel. It's very rare. And I just know like, oh, well, here comes this week. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad or it's miserable. It's just not fun. That's a small example of my framework for recovery.
Well, you say, yeah, it's got to be intentional. And what I tell everybody out there is that from a recovery standpoint, you cannot do what we do and not have some sort of intermittent and or intentional framework, as you're saying, for recovery, whether it be hydrating, sleep, rest and relaxation, connection. Hey, maybe you want to go to the horse track. Maybe you want to go gambling. Maybe you want to go whatever. Whatever it is. I don't really care, but it can't be. You don't make it through our career by accident. And for anybody that's out there in a leadership position, should not be surprised by mental health anymore, or line of duty death, or injury, or suicide. We don't want any of that to happen, but we know that's part of what's going on. And if you get bored with me, you just tell me that you left me. For those of you that are watching, Chris just disappeared on the screen, but that's okay. He'll be back. It's too hot out there for Wi-Fi in Texas. So again, we talked about 4 R's today. We didn't set it up that way, but really, we didn't say that to you in the beginning, but it was, what are the challenges in the fire service these days? And, mental health is up there, but the number 1 and 2 or 3 things, depending on who you talk to, is recruitment, retention. We added in there. Welcome back, Chris.
Sorry about that.
And then retirement and recovery, not just from a mental health standpoint, like if you have a disorder or an illness, but from a daily repertoire. And Chris was talking about having a framework. I used the word, a plan of some sort for your recovery with intention. So one of the cool things that has been talked about now for many years in the fire service has been peer support to support that framework. You're a peer supporter for McKinney. I was fortunate enough to be down there back in, I think, 17 or 18 to do a class for your department. Wonderful group of people. Obviously, I work for the IFF, and there's 50 of us that are trained peer supporters, or actually master trainers that go out and do this. So McKinney has a peer support team, right?
Yep, absolutely.
So for those of people that are listening, whether they are brand new on a job all the way up to the fire chief, and they've heard about peer support, but they don't know where to start. And let's just say that as 80% of the departments across the country are not IFF members. What's the framework? What's the function? And what are the first steps of what somebody has to do to get a peer support going?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, you have to recognize that you need every department, in my opinion, needs a peer support team. Whether you're a volunteer paid, EMS, not EMS, 100,000 runs a year, 100 runs a year, you need a peer support team. So super important. The first step that I would say is reach out to other people that, has a peer support team. And even if you don't know anyone that has a peer support team, there's fire engineering, right? There's plenty of articles and resources there. There's, like you said, we don't get in the Google Docs, but there's Google. There's no sense in trying to do it on your own. There's no sense in reinventing the wheel, if you will. Reach out to other people in the fire service and figure out. And maybe the peer support team in McKinney doesn't fit the model of the peer support team that you need in your department, or Chicago or Dallas or anyone else, right? But it can give you a framework to start with. So that's first and foremost. And you can start small. You don't have to build a 50-member peer support team from day one. And you can identify what the role of your peer support team is, right? As you know, Dan, we both know that there's just as much peer support that happens for the brothers and sisters outside of the calls that happen for the calls, right? And the stuff we call behind the scenes that people don't really know about. So there's that. And then for me, I'm a big believer in you have to identify the mission of your peer support team. So I am not a licensed counselor. I am not a therapist. And so for me, in the peer support sense, my theory is to stabilize the situation to get you to where you need to be, right? Should you need to be somewhere. And there's a few things with that. There is maybe you just need to go to a counseling session, right? Maybe you need to go somewhere, which we'll get to in a second, right? But I think that's the big thing. Realizing and understanding, convincing yourself, convincing the powers that be, if you will, that a peer support team is necessary, right? And then reach out to people within that arena. There's no sense in trying to do it all on your own and, well, what if this, what if that, and prepare for this and prepare for that, because you and I both know, Dan, you're going to wind up in a situation where you're like, well, I didn't learn about this situation in class. I took a 32-hour peer support for the individual response person, and I don't remember this chapter, right? So that's key. And then identifying what your mission is, because you don't, in my opinion, peer support's not designed to be the counselor. It's not designed to replace the counselor. It's not designed to be the therapist. It's not designed to be AA, right? None of that. For me, it is, how can I come in? How can I stabilize the situation? And either they're good, maybe they just need somebody to talk to, fine. Took in a bad run. Or you're like, well, we need to get this guy somewhere, right? Out of my league. So if you don't define your mission, then that can get very blurry.
Yeah. So if I hear you correctly, it's definitely got to be part of the department structure within the organization. If you don't know how to start it, reach out. Obviously, anybody could Google you, could Google me, could reach out to fire engineering, can reach out to the IFF, the National Volunteer Fire Council, whatever, their neighbor, somebody, and start the conversation with it. There has to be a framework in a sense of the mission and the function. And like you said it great, stabilize. It may include counseling, but stay within your reach as a peer. And we know to be there, be present, listen, and to refer. That's not rocket science. Anybody can do that. Your formal peer support can develop over time, but you got to identify somebody we always call it a champion. There's got to be a chief to buy in. And that's the good side, but the downside. If the chief doesn't buy in, well, if you don't have a union for, in the president and the board to start it, then it's really an uphill battle. But as a chief, that should be a standard to start looking at. And then the first steps really, in my opinion, chief can't run it, deputy can't run it, battalion chief can't run it, union president can't run it. You got to have a champion. And once you find that champion, they will do the heavy lifting with the support of the chief.
Yeah, and they certainly can't run it. What they can be though, is they can be part of it. I know on our peer support team, we have members of each rank, and I think that there is value in that, right? Having the firefighter, the battalion chiefs, the captains, because there's importance with that. And then I think the getting them somewhere, right? We haven't really talked on that and what that looks like. Interesting enough, you work for Recovery Ways.
I do.
Right. So, whether it's the IFF Center for Excellence, it's Recovery Ways. There's different places out there. Unfortunately, there's not enough one place can't just take everybody. Right. So there's a need for multiple places, but Recovery Ways.
Yeah, it's no
Talk about it
different.
for a second.
And two things. I'll answer that, but I said, reach out. You said, look inside. So I want to be clear that if you're the fire chief, if you're the training officer, if you're somebody that's been, in the exempt rank that's been tasked with starting a peer support, send out an email.
Yeah.
You may have somebody within there that's been a peer support of another department, been trained, who knows what. So you don't have to go and call me or Chris.
No,
you can start from within and then build out from there.
You certainly can do that. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no. And the second piece in regards to resources, just like an incident commander having resources available, if you're a fire chief or a union president or somebody in charge that doesn't have a list of resources for a chaplain, a counselor, a therapist, a psychiatrist, an inpatient, outpatient setting, I'm just going to say shame on you, because of all the conversations we're talking about for the better part of umpteen years, we know we're going to be affected. That's how you started the conversation today. We're going to be affected. It doesn't mean you're going to die. It doesn't mean you're not going to be able to finish your career, but you're going to be affected. How long? I don't know. But then with those resources, you get an assessment, a conversation with somebody that is trained in that area. And the reason I'm with Recovery Ways is because I see that there's more mental health, not necessarily PTSD. I see symptoms of PTSD, but I see a lot of anxiety, dysthymia, which is a lower level depression, and also, unfortunately, bipolar disorder, which is really a chemical imbalance. And I won't get into the whole thing, but those three pieces, most of the organizations I know and I used to belong to didn't treat that from a primary aspect, and Recovery Ways does. Recovery Ways is out of Utah. It's got a Valor Healing program, but even better, it has a program that focuses on primary mental health that the better part of the country, not just fire service, police, fire, military, corrections, mom, dad, sister, brother, are dealing with. Because 1 in 5 people are dealing with a primary mental health condition. That could be your spouse, your son, your daughter, your mom or dad. And we support that as well at Recovery Ways. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And again, not everybody has to go inpatient. Not everybody has to go to a PHP. But as you showed some vulnerability and shared that you do a maintenance schedule, just like you do your physical schedule, you're better for it. Same as me.
Yeah, without a doubt. It just, I knew for me, things in the past that I was doing wasn't working well. So I had to change something. And I changed some stuff and it was working. And I was like, I'm not going to test those waters by not doing it. Mental health is super important. Peer support is super important. Reach out to me, reach out to Dan. There's so many things that we don't think about maybe when we're new to it, that you're like, it's an easy answer. We just don't think about it, right? Like maybe you're listening right now and you're like, oh, they mentioned counselor. Well, yeah, we got a counselor we can call. Well, that counselor works between the hours of 8 and 5. What happens when the incident happens at 2 a.m.? Right? What happens when you need to get a guy into a center? Who do you call? So there's just a lot of little things that can be navigated. And it's kind of like some of it easy to do as you're going. Some of it, it's like until you've been there, you don't know. I mean, we've had those conversations recently, right? Helping someone, I called you and I'm like, Dan, I don't know. Like, I'm just trying to navigate this as I go. And I think you even told me that's how it is sometimes, right? So,
hey, how do you think I learned? How do you think my buddy Frank Lido in New York learned? Trial by fire, but we don't have to do that.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Be humble enough to reach out. Like, don't put the tough guy mantra aside and just pick up the phone and go, hey man, can you help me?
Well,
right?
And that's
and
why
we might not have the right answer, but what we can do is share our experience.
Well, if my grades in college were any indication, yeah, but that's why Chief Rhodes gave us his platform. And with that said, we don't always have to come up with the topic. If you're somebody that, hey, maybe you want to be a guest on a show, maybe you're brand new in the field of the fire service, you want us to talk about something, share something, have a guest on, or you want to be a guest on this. That's what Chief Rhodes wants us to do because, again, I'm from the baby boomer. The greatest generation is about 7% of the population. The baby boomers are about 30, but we're all in retirement or semi-retirement. The next, right, millennial, X, Z, and whatever other thing is happening now. You're 60%, if not more, of the workforce, and things are going to continue to change. So we want to hear from you, and you want to any last words and close it out?
No, if they have topics, they want to be on the show, then reach out, right? Reach out to one of us, and we'd love to have someone on the show. But even if they had a topic, we'd love to do it.
We hope to have your chief on the show in a couple coming episodes to talk about peer support from his position, the needs, the challenges, and to have a conversation.
Yeah. We will have him soon. It'll be exciting. So,
all right. Well, Chris, a pleasure as always. We're just a little bit past that 1 hour mark, so I want to stay true to my words. For all of you out there that joined us, thanks, and hopefully this was beneficial. We'll see you next time.
See ya.